Welcome to ESG Decoded, where we unravel the business complexities at the intersection of environmental, social, and governance issues.
I'm Erica Schiller, and I'm joined by my ClimeCo colleagues, Emma Cox and Anna Stablem.
Get ready to explore the intersection of sustainability, innovation, and ethical leadership, the dynamic forces shaping our global economy.
From climate action to social responsibility, we're here to decode the ESG landscape by interviewing interesting leading figures across the globe that will empower you with actionable insights.
Whether you're a seasoned practitioner or just embarking on your sustainability journey, this podcast is your compass for navigating the future of responsible business practices.
Let's decode ESG together.
Special thanks to Amazon Sustainability for their support and sponsorship of this episode. Amazon's operations include data and fulfillment centers, corporate buildings, and a global transportation network. A footprint that comes with responsibility. That's why Amazon is working toward a carbon-free energy future by optimizing efficiency, investing where it matters most, and supporting the communities where we operate. From more efficient data centers to an increasingly electrified delivery network, we're rethinking how energy is used from the server to the doorstep. Learn more at amazon.com/sustainability. Welcome to ESG Decoded. The future of ESG has been debated from every angle. But what are companies actually doing in response? Joining me today is Andrew Jones, Principal Researcher at the Conference Board. The Conference Board is a nonprofit business membership and research association. It provides business insights, conducts research, and organizes events and conferences to help organizations navigate complex business challenges. Drawing on new research, we'll separate the headlines from reality and examine how companies are adapting, where sustainability is becoming more integrated into business strategy, and what leaders should be paying attention to next. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me, Emma.
Wonderful. Well, let's get into the conversation. I'm really excited to dig into sort of what is happening in this ESG landscape. You know, we're currently at a time where there's a lot of uncertainty around what ESG might look like in the near term and hopefully not the long term, but we will get into that in a bit. So today we're really going to dig into where is ESG headed, what's standing in the way, and sort of how companies are adapting in real time. We'll mention a few interesting statistics, and these statistics were derived from a survey actually conducted by the Conference Board earlier this year, where they surveyed 125 sustainability professionals. So, Andrew, let's get into it. I would love to hear a little bit about Andrew Jones to get us started. So please introduce yourself to our listeners. We'd love to hear from you in terms of how did you get into the space? How did you arrive along the journey into this role?
Sure, it's a pleasure to be here, Emma, and I appreciate the opportunity to share some of my background before we begin. So, I would describe myself as a multidisciplinary researcher and practitioner. I actually come from an academic background. I actually trained as a historian. I have a doctorate in modern history where I focused on a lot of issues, but my doctoral research actually covered international NGOs, humanitarianism, sustainable development, global governance. That's been a world that I've been interested in for a long time, and I think many reasons why I'm so interested in that. I think it just spans sort of policy, economics, governance, sort of emerging nations, sustainability. Yeah, and that sort of in more recent years, I transitioned from academia. I entered into the NGO world. Actually, worked for a few years leading research and policy at an international NGO that focused on climate smart housing and infrastructure in emerging markets, particularly Africa and Asia. I held a similar role for the World Bank. And then more recently, I joined the conference board, which you so eloquently introduced, where I now lead a lot of the conference board's research when it comes to corporate governance, corporate sustainability, corporate citizenship, ESG in general. So I think I've had an interesting journey that's sort of taken me from academia to practitioner, but I like to think that many of those sort of skills and perspectives and ways of looking at the world and ways of thinking about sources and data that I originally sort of developed in an academic landscape, particularly in a sort of humanities context, I still carry with me today in the world of ESG and sustainability. And I sometimes like to tell myself I was working in ESG long before I really thought of it as ESG. I thought of it as international development, as sort of sustainable development, as humanitarianism, as philanthropy. That was sort of my original background. So these days I'm keeping very busy, like us all, sort of trying to stay abreast of the fast-moving landscape and the political and economic and regulatory uncertainty that I think has characterized this year. But it's also a really exciting time to be in a think tank, working with some fantastic companies, working with the broader business world and the broader practitioner world to try and make sense and hopefully bring a bit of a non-partisan big picture, which is what we try to do best at the conference board. So it's great to be here today to share some of our data and some of our insights.
That's fantastic, Andrew. I love that we're talking to a historian by background who is researching current data and trends and yet leaning, I'm sure, on sort of the history to help us sort of inform the future. So we've got all sort of tenses covered here. And so good data we'll be talking about a little bit more in this episode. So let's ground ourselves in the current moment. Currently, ESG is facing a bit of a backlash moment, I call it, right? And so we're at this sort of state of flux, a bit of uncertainty, as I mentioned at the beginning. Our current US administration is sort of anti-ESG. And so a lot of companies are really just having a tough time figuring out what to do next, right? And so I think that some of this data will be incredibly compelling to these sustainability leaders trying to make decisions about their strategy. So according to your research and your survey, 90% of corporate leaders say anti-ESG sentiment will grow or hold steady. I want to dig into that in a little bit, Andrew. 80% have already shifted strategy in response. 52% are now reframing or stepping away from the term ESG altogether. Okay, so this is painting a bit of a dire picture. And I would like to remain hopeful, right? And I'm sure a lot of our listeners would too, Andrew. So tell us, is this a temporary sort of storm or state of flux or backlash, or is this a sign of a fundamental and ongoing repositioning?
I think this is a really great question, Emma. And I think first of all, to answer your question directly, I do think this is more than a temporary moment. I do think we may be in a sort of more structural period of adjustment for sort of the sustainability and ESG landscape. I think few trends that have been bubbling up and building for a few years now perhaps have converged this year in a way that was already perhaps happening, but has taken on a new intensity. I think on the one hand, you've had this sort of march towards like global march really towards sort of more regulated sustainability, mandatory disclosures for companies, investors and stakeholders being quite vocal on ESG, and ESG becoming sort of perhaps a more embedded component of corporate governance. But we've seen maybe some slowdown on that regard and some more fragmentation and more uncertainty. And I think that's at the same time that trend is perhaps interlocked with and perhaps even collided with, what you use the terminology of backlash, right? So heightened political and legal scrutiny of ESG and its sort of surrounding universe, particularly in the US. And I think that there's many reasons what's been driving that, and it's now perhaps become codified in certain state and federal actions. I think the collision of these forces has perhaps created a phase of, I guess, what you could call recalibration as many companies sort of try and navigate these uncertain waters and sharpen their focus and keep sort of their core commitments intact. But I certainly, I guess, to your point about ground disruptors, I don't think this is a period of retreat, but perhaps more one of evolution and change.
Yeah, I want to dig into that just a little bit more, Andrew, because, Climeco works quite a bit with companies that are either developing strategies or well on their way to implementation, right? When it comes to ESG. And from Climeco's perspective, we're not seeing any slowdown in terms of the action. We're seeing a lot of recalibration as it relates to language and communications and perhaps, a shifting in terms of what makes sense for the business, in terms of what drives value for the business, which I really think is actually a smart way to look at integrating ESG and sustainability into a company's overall strategy for growth, right? So is that an accurate depiction, do you think, or a reading of these tea leaves? What would you say?
I really agree, and I think you worded it really nicely. And I think that comes out in a lot of the data we have, and I think it also comes out in all the conversations we have with our member companies and our sustainability leaders day in, day out, right? That the landscape has evolved, and I think certain sort of cultural expectations have evolved, and language and terminology have really adapted this year. And of course, that's not a trend that's unique just to ESG. I think you've seen a very similar thing in the DEI space, perhaps even more intense than has in ESG. And you cited one of our data points that over half of the sustainability leaders that we surveyed have reported that this year, in response to this environment, they've actually been narrowing ESG communications or reframing ESG communications, or simply walking away from the term ESG altogether. I think realizing that there are many reasons why that term became so prominent. And I think it was a helpful term in many ways. It's perhaps become more politicized in recent years, and even perhaps has become an unhelpful distraction. I think we've seen perhaps a substitution of that term with more palatable language for the broader audiences, such as impact or sustainability. So I think we're definitely seeing big changes there, right? And those are, we shouldn't underplay those changes, but at the same time, it's one thing to change messaging and language and terminology and framing. It's another thing to change strategy and commitment and resources. And I think actually the strategies remain, in my experience, and I think you see in our survey, remain intact. Those underlying commitments remain there. I think there were business reasons that encouraged a focus on sustainability in the first place. And whether that's managing stakeholder expectations, actually managing the firm's bottom line, positioning the firm for long-term resilience, long-term market positioning, those remain not just intact, but perhaps more important than ever. And I actually think the version of corporate ESG and sustainability that perhaps is emerging from this moment is, in my perspective, more business aligned, more disciplined, more focused on, to use your language, the ROI and the business case for this action. I think that can be seen as a very positive trend. Actually, it can be seen as not just as a positive trend, but a maturing of the entire sustainability discipline as it becomes more integrated into the fabric of the business at these big corporations.
So let's, Andrew, get into a little bit of, okay, so there is pushback. There is this backlash moment. Who is driving it, right? So in your survey, there is an interesting statistic that says 78% of executives cite policymakers and regulators as the top source of ESG backlash, replacing activists as the primary instigators, which is a shift from 2022. So my question to you, Andrew, is how are companies recalibrating communications and stakeholder strategies based on this new power dynamic? And we covered a little bit of this, but I think let's dig into more of the sort of why.
Sure. Yeah. And if you'll indulge me, I'll just quickly contextualize that data point a bit, where we asked a similar question a couple of years ago. Who are the main sources of ESG backlash, or the most intense sources of ESG backlash that you've experienced at your firm? And we definitely heard then that activists and advocacy groups are sort of the number one kind of driver, followed by state level policymakers in the US. This was the time when we were starting to see many anti-ESG laws enacted at the state level, followed sort of third by federal policymakers. Now when we've asked the survey in the context of 2025, perhaps for obvious reasons, federal policymakers are way out in front. And I think it reflects sort of the federalization of the anti-ESG initiatives that we've seen in the last few years, and perhaps indicates expectations of more formalized policy interventions coming in the years to come. So I think it's just sort of underscores what we've already been discussing, that it's a challenging environment. In terms of, to answer your question directly, how are companies perhaps recalibrating therefore in this moment and this new paradigm? I think there's many things we can touch on, right? I think we already spoke about sort of reframing the language and changing acronyms and so on. But I think perhaps more fundamentally, I think there's a strong argument here, and I think many companies are doing it, to really sort of narrow the focus, right? And really hone in on what are those material issues, right? What are those issues that are really relevant to your firm and to your industry. So as we know, there's a huge laundry list of issues that come under the umbrella of E, S, and G, but not all of them are material. And I think ultimately a closer understanding of what is and isn't material, a closer understanding of what really resonates with the firm and its stakeholders and the communities in which it operates, and ensuring that business value is part of that conversation, I think is a really strong best practice that we're seeing in this moment, and I think seeing come out of this moment. So that's something I'd really touch on, I think. And then at the same hand, perhaps reducing some of the more symbolic or lower priority messaging, right, that perhaps don't have such a clear linkage to the core business or to its core stakeholders. So I think it's very rational to minimize exposure to controversy and really focus on what's a priority, right? We can't do it all, so we should focus on really where we can move the needle.
Sure, this might be sort of a welcome recalibration moment. So there's always a silver lining, right?
There is, and I think it is worth underscoring that point, because it is easy, obviously, to fall into sort of pessimistic narratives, particularly perhaps when policy signals have changed and momentum has slowed or adapted. But I think swings of the pendulum can also be opportunities to really sort of revisit what is the real strategy here, right? How committed are we as a company, and what does our commitment look like in practice, and how does that play out, and which stakeholders are we really talking about, when we talk about serving stakeholders, and where are we showing up? So I think these are actually really important questions that I think perhaps gain a new urgency and a new clarity in times maybe where there's headwinds. So I do think that is a silver lining. I think it is a positive outcome that can come from difficult moments of pushback.
Wonderful. Well, while we're talking about headwinds, you segued so nicely for me, Andrew. I really want to double click on what exactly are those headwinds and flashpoints, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges that some of these corporate sustainability leaders are facing today. So, and I just want to pause, and I should have caveated this earlier, but Andrew, the survey that the conference board conducted is a US survey, correct?
In practice, correct. Yes, it was a survey that was, predominantly US based and multinational corporations. The audience is very large in terms of the corporate audience. So many of the companies we surveyed are global and have a global footprint, but headquartered in the US, and I guess therefore surveying executives based in the US. So I think there is a US perspective here for sure.
Okay, just want to clarify. Great. All right, let's dig into those headwinds. So I'm going to read another set of statistics here. So 66% of executives say tariffs and trade restrictions will disrupt sustainability goals. And 45% say that they will delay investments in sustainable operations. Those are some big numbers, Andrew. So how should sustainability and supply chain leaders sort of adjust under this trade policy pressure?
Yeah, it's interesting data, right? And obviously against a backdrop of a lot of focus on tariffs and trade policies this year in the US and all the uncertainty that's come with that. And therefore, as you said, 66% very concerned that the current or future trade measures will or already have impeded sustainability goals. These are really interesting findings. And I can add as well, in addition to the 45% that feel that trade uncertainty in general is going to delay their sustainability work. Over 40% also cited sort of specific kind of aspects, whether that's cost pressures on sustainable materials or tariffs on solar or renewable energy imports. So there's some very specific concerns here about tariffs alongside a more broader concern about what the general economic slowdown does to some of this work. In terms of your question around what should we be doing, how do we do it? I think there's many things that sustainability leaders and supply chain leaders can do, right? I think perhaps the starting point is really mapping tariff exposure, and different companies obviously have different kind of programs, different initiatives, different commitments. They may have different dependencies here, but I think particularly when it comes to some of the work around decarbonization, right? Identifying those materials and components and technologies, whether it's steel, it's batteries, it's solar panels that face elevated duties. I think you have to really understand your supply chain a bit more from an ESG lens, right? I think once you've done that, you can then perhaps, I think this definitely requires close collaboration between ESG and supply chain leaders, start perhaps looking for tactics, right? Whether it's diversifying sourcing, developing alternative supply chains, perhaps that draw more tariff neutral or friendly jurisdictions, perhaps further integrating environmental performance into supplier selection, which is something we've been seeing already happening in the last few years, but I wonder if this might give that an extra sort of impetus. And normally, perhaps more fundamentally within the firm itself, I think just strengthening that cross-functional collaboration, right? I think clearly sustainability and procurement need to work together, but I think finance and legal teams are also an important part of this journey to understand trade-related risks and act on them accordingly. But I think this is a pressing challenge. I think often the coverage of tariffs isn't often always focused on the sustainability elements, but I think there's a significant challenge here particularly around materials and certain inputs. But be very interesting to monitor this in the years to come.
Yeah, I think there's perhaps a deprioritization for sustainability and ESG initiatives based on this current near-term need. So it's really too bad as a sustainability professional. We would advise our clients to really not lose sight of the potential risks associated with climate change now, right? Because if we're stopping now, we're only going to face it more in the future. So easier said than done. But let's talk a little bit about one component of this, which is really the commitments, right? So a lot of these goals, we're seeing some headlines where companies are walking back their commitments. So in your survey, you show that 50% of executives say climate and net zero goals will be the top ESG flashpoint of 2025. So I guess my question, Andrew, is climate becoming politically radioactive? And how are leading companies holding the line or pivoting?
I think this is a great question. I think it's a really interesting data point. And I should add, they said it will be the top ESG flashpoint in 2025 and beyond. And that ranked to the list of a long list of potential choices they could have identified. So I think climate action has become a really visible and contested ESG issue, right? In the way that perhaps it wasn't just a few years ago. I think we can see that play out in real time when you look at some of the policy development, some of the sort of rhetoric and messaging that we see, right? I think there's many things that have fueled that, particularly in the US, where I think climate has become perhaps part of a sort of broader process of partisanship, of polarization, of sort of the cultural wars, for want of a better word. And I think that has had an impact on business, right? It has had an impact on sort of the net zero pledges. It's had an impact on sort of some of the climate messaging. Perhaps sort of stakeholder support has slightly weakened for maybe climate action compared to a few years ago, where it was really a lot of momentum, I think, coming out of some of the COPs. So it's a difficult moment. I don't think I go so I say climate's become politically radioactive, thankfully, but I do think it's challenging. I think companies are recalibrating, I think is probably how I describe it. I think similar to the kind of the broader reframing that we spoke about earlier, I think companies are perhaps becoming a little more tighter on the way they talk about climate. Perhaps not as vocal about some of the commitments, but maintaining those commitments internally. I think presenting perhaps decarbonization internally as perhaps less sort of moral or ethical framing and more really linking it to the business case, linking it to the supply chain, linking it to cost control, linking it to maintaining investor confidence, linking it to regulatory requirements. We know there's a lot of regulations coming in the coming years that will require companies to disclose what they do in climate, including at the US state level, and remaining pragmatic in targets. And you mentioned there's been a lot of coverage of companies rolling back climate goals, or at least perceived to be rolling back climate goals. I think there's definitely been some element of that for sure. But I also think there's been some of the adjustments to corporate climate goals have been because companies have become a bit better at actually understanding the trajectories that they're actually on, and what were once perhaps aspirational targets that were made with the best of intentions, but not necessarily grounded in the company's own sort of decarbonization pathway. I think there's now a clearer perspective. And I think we shouldn't always be so quick to criticize just because climate targets have been adjusted. I think it may actually reflect a more mature reality. And I can say from a lot of the benchmarking work that we do, companies are continuing to disclose, extensive information on climate, continuing to work hard on climate. And I think there is a real perception that climate risk is a material risk across a lot of industries. And I don't see that fading away just because perhaps the rhetoric has become a bit more challenging and the political environment's become more challenging. But it's only more complex than it was, not that long ago.
Yeah, no, again, I think, it's just interesting to dig into the why here. And what an interesting insight that you just mentioned around, perhaps this is just companies sort of realizing what it actually takes and recalibrating their initiatives to invest in the initiatives that make the most amount of impact or have the highest amount of value against their bottom line. So in a way, again, I see this as perhaps maybe a positive recalibration for corporate sustainability goals altogether. So this is great. Great reframing.
Thank you. And I do think, there is a reframing. And of course, there's also a broader environment in which these goals are being articulated, right? And we know, for example, that things are changing, right? Projected electricity demand in the US is huge for the next few years and decades, right? Because of a lot of things, including electrification of buildings, of vehicles, also data centers and AI, right? So I think there's a new and complex and evolving reality that this work is also happening in, right? So I think we have to keep that in mind as well, that the environment in which goals were set maybe as recently as 5 years ago was a different landscape to today's landscape, and not just politically, but actually maybe more fundamentally as well.
Wonderful. Well, Andrew, let's pivot. I know we've been talking a lot of the challenges, a lot of the rollbacks, a lot of the controversy. Let's give our listeners a little more of a positive outlook into the future here. So let's talk about sort of the progress, I think, and what data suggests ESG is maturing rather than collapsing. I'm also curious if you could tell us a little more, Andrew, about sort of who's getting it right. Are there companies that are doing well? And if so, how are they measuring their success, their progress? And then finally, I know this is a long list of questions for you to consider, but really curious if you could share with us sort of what are boards doing right now outside of sort of the sustainability professionals? And maybe this is just a perspective from you, but what do you think boards are doing right now that they weren't 2 years ago as it relates to sustainability and decarbonization initiatives?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. And I actually think the question of boards is really interesting. And at the conference board, we have the privilege of working a lot with boards and board directors. And I do think there's some interesting trends there. So perhaps if I start with sort of, you asked about what data suggests ESG is maturing, and I think there's a lot we can point to and be optimistic about. I think, first of all, the disclosures, right? While on the one hand, we know the messaging might be changing and the framing might be changing and the language might be changing. Companies, particularly corporate America, it's disclosing more than it's ever disclosed when it comes to environmental data. And it's increasingly, we're starting to see climate sort of emissions data has been completely mainstreamed, including Scope 3. And we're starting to really see a rise of more meaningful big picture disclosure on, biodiversity and water and other issues too. And I think there's strong momentum for disclosures, right? And I think the incoming regulations on both sides of the Atlantic will only further drive that process. Of course, as you know, just because you disclose something doesn't necessarily mean you're making progress on it. But I think it's critical baseline, right? To understand what companies are doing and for stakeholders to then use that data to sort of push and prod and influence.
That's actually interesting, Andrew. I was at a conference the other day where the speaker said that they were spending as a company more on disclosure than they were on the actual impact initiative. So my question, I guess, back to you before we get on to the other topics I mentioned is, what is the right balance, right? Because I agree with you, disclosure is very important, but it seems to me that companies are investing a ton in resources for not only third-party consultants, but also hiring, devoted resources to work on disclosure, right? And then just the cost and investment is becoming more of a burden than it is to invest in the actual progress a company can make. So talk about that a little bit before we move on.
It's a really great question. I think introduces some important nuance into the discussion, right? Yes, I think disclosure is essential. Companies aren't disclosing, we're not sure what the state of progress is, right? But I think you are correct that in the last year, seen extensive push for disclosure, right? A lot of reporting frameworks, ambitious regulations being implemented, companies gearing up for, particularly what's coming out of Europe. And there has been a lot of money invested, a lot of resources, a lot of time, and I definitely have heard frustrations from within companies, particularly when I think obviously disclosure then becomes an end in itself. We're disclosing to disclose, right? We're not disclosing we don't have the time anymore or the bandwidth to actually then leverage that for action, right? So what I would say in response to your question, I think we are seeing some recalibration in that world, right? Obviously, I'm sure as many listeners know, the ambitious sustainability reporting regulations coming out of Europe, in particular the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is currently undergoing, I think, quite significant trimming. And while what that looks like finally is still to be determined. I think you could expect a more streamlined framework to come out of that applies to fewer companies. So I think these are positive developments. I think my hope is, and perhaps it's an optimistic hope, but my hope is that from the current moment of uncertainty, we will see more streamlined reporting requirements, and we will see consistency and harmonization between different frameworks that I hope will allow companies to find that balance, right? Where we're sharing data, the data is meaningful, the data is audited, the data is comparable for investors. But yes, it's not just, that isn't the sole task of the sustainability team. And the sustainability team is able to leverage that data to drive change within the business, because that's only why we're here, right? That's only why we're doing this, to see that sustainable transformation. But it's an important point. And I think we always have to remember when we're discussing disclosures that fine line is a difficult line to find. But I tend to like to see disclosures. I guess the researcher in me loves to see the data, but I recognize it's been a challenge and a cost burden for companies as well.
Great. Thank you for that. So to prompt you and remind you what I had asked earlier. Yeah. So tell us about any success stories, any companies in your research come to mind that are doing this well, navigating this complex environment well?
Yeah, sure. And I think, we work with a lot of sustainability. Many sustainability leaders deserve a lot of credit right now, for staying the course in a complex and uncertain landscape. I guess I would like to take the opportunity to point out a few companies. Actually, earlier this year, the conference board, we honored six companies at our annual Corporate Responsibility Awards. That was earlier this year in New York, where we recognized sort of leadership in sustainability and innovation in corporate citizenship. And they're six very different companies, right? Six very different sort of markets and backgrounds and positioning. But we honored AT&T, Alf Beauty, Prudential Financial, Medtronic, Webster Bank, and Yum Brands. And I think all in their own way fully deserve their recognition for sort of advancing sustainability, advancing social impact, and advancing environmental impact and stakeholder concerns in these challenging times. So I'm grateful to take the opportunity to sort of underscore our gratitude to those companies and those award winners.
So I know you can't sort of go into each of those awards, but were there any sort of themes that stood out for you, Andrew, in terms of why were these companies being honored? What does success look like in today's sort of day and age?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. I think all in their own way very different, right? Different sectors, different sort of positions. But I think all sort of have really made that commitment to sustainability that goes beyond sort of, beyond the surface level, really integrating sustainability and broader sort of notions of social and environmental impact into the firm, whether that's into the core business model, into the product, into sort of driving the work forward and not necessarily existing in silos, but even sort of integrating into big corporate goals where the line between the business and sustainability is no longer clear, which I think is how it should be. It obviously makes the work more challenging and more complex as well, but I think that is the aspiration, right? That the goals that the company sets for itself are simultaneously for the business, where it's driving new markets, driving new customers, but at the same hand, have a very firm sustainability and ESG lens. So I think that was a commonality across some very diverse award winners.
That's really helpful. Thank you for sharing that, Andrew. Okay, and then again, sort of tell us about what are the boards doing right now, and maybe dig a little bit further into what's changed in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely seen ESG and sustainability move up the standing agenda for boards. I think many boards, particularly corporate America, definitely have stronger oversight and a closer engagement in the work, and sustainability officers presenting to the board and presenting to specific board committees. I think we're seeing boards much more active when it comes to sort of specific actions, whether that's sort of scenario planning and integrating, it's climate or regulatory scenarios into risk reviews, spreading ESG oversight across committees, rather than just putting it one place that's perhaps quite siloed. I think seeing a lot of sort of closer collaboration between sustainability and legal at sort of the board level, right? And I think that partly reflects the landscape which we're now in. There is definitely sort of a legal and reputational risk concern, but I think it also shows it's moved up the agenda. And I think we've seen a recognition of the close link between ESG and the workforce and talent. Whether that's sort of ESG being actually quite important for attracting talent, retaining talent, building a positive culture, and those are issues that are top of mind for the board. And I think that's actually a really important space where ESG and sustainability can and should be playing. So that's something I've seen in the last couple of years really open up at the board level. And I think that trend's here to stay for the foreseeable.
Wow. Well, Andrew, that sort of highlights a trend that has been popping up in our conversation a lot, which is this concept of ESG/sustainability/decarbonization/climate action really merging with businesses. Cross-functionality of that work is going to be incredibly important. And it sounds like this is happening in real time. And companies are realizing they really have to sort of integrate these concepts into how they do business. And it's everyone's job. So this is really an encouraging thing to see. Wonderful. Well, let's get into a bit of a fun quickfire round. Andrew, if you're up for it, you ready to go?
100%. Who doesn't love a quickfire round, Emily?
Wonderful. Okay. Tell me, Andrew, what is a buzzword in this space, in this industry, that you wish we'd retire, we'd get rid of altogether?
So I think there's actually quite a few buzzwords I would like to dispense with. I think there's a lot of jargon out there. A buzzword I think we would like to retire, and I'm probably guilty of using it myself, is stakeholder capitalism, which has been a common phrase in the last few years. Right? Perhaps so I can explain myself, because I think this concept is very well intentioned, and I think has been an important concept in the last few years, and I think captured a specific moment perhaps 4 or 5 years ago. I think business leader, it really sort of signaled businesses considering a broader set of stakeholders, right, beyond the bottom line. And so I think this concept has done a lot of good. But my concern is in the last few years, perhaps that the term stakeholder capitalism has perhaps become a bit unhelpful and unclear. Often it raises questions of which stakeholders, right? Which stakeholders take precedence? If stakeholder interests conflict, who wins out? And obviously in the US, it's perhaps even been pulled into sort of broader culture war debates and misrepresented as a move completely away from the bottom line and shareholders, right? So for those reasons, I think I would like to see it, if not retired, at the very least, perhaps reframed and maybe tweaked a little bit, because I think at this point it might be unhelpful rather than helpful.
That's an interesting take. Okay, stakeholder capitalism removed. All right. What about a practice you think deserves more attention in this space?
So again, I think there's quite a few things you could potentially cite here. I think reflecting on this, I might say biodiversity and nature-related risks, right? I think there's been a lot of attention on biodiversity in the last few years, right? But I still think this may be underrepresented in some corporate strategies, despite sort of emerging regulations and despite investor scrutiny starting to ramp up a bit. And I guess the reason I say this, I think, because biodiversity is so important, right? That actually, so much GDP depends on nature, on whether it's for raw materials or water supply. And I think we all know the loss of biodiversity can really have a hugely disruptive impact. So I think I would like to see biodiversity, I think it's already happening, but perhaps continue to move up the agenda a little bit and maybe even be more closely aligned with some of the climate and decarbonization work.
I love that. I'm sure we could have a whole other podcast episode on biodiversity, which I'm sure we will. All right. Now, we talked about a company that's navigating this moment well, or companies, and you listed a few there. What about a sector or a industry?
It's always hard to choose, because I think every sector in its own way is confronting, a lot of difficult issues, different sort of material issues, different sort of positions, different policy angles. I do think one sector that comes to mind for me, first of all, I think utilities. The utility sector, as we know, is the most regulated sector. It's the sector that's it's on that front line of energy generation. I think utilities firms, in my experience, have been very proactive in sort of helping to drive the energy transition in recent years, and are now having to obviously pivot in a more challenging moment. So I would call out the utilities sector, but in doing so, I certainly could have called out many other sectors too. I think there's exemplary companies across the private sector in this regard.
Great. Wonderful. And finally, Andrew, what are you listening to or reading for your sort of daily content in ESG and sustainability outside of your own research?
And outside of ESG Decoded, of course, Emma, I would say, I'm sure, like so many of the listeners, right? There's so many great sources of information. We get what we can from multiple sources, right? Something I find myself going to a lot is I really like FT, the Financial Times Moral Money newsletter. I think that's it's very regular. I think some great sort of global sustainability and finance and policy developments. Also quite a big kind of responsible investor for those who subscribe. I think they have some really detailed coverage of investing trends. And of course, last I would say that I'll cheat a little bit, the conference board. We have a lot of great data, so do check us out.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrew. This brings us to the end of our time together, unfortunately. I'm sure we could continue this conversation for hours. So first, let me ask you, where can listeners follow your work at the conference board? Where can they dig into the research a bit more?
Sure. Yeah. So you can find our latest work on ESG, sustainability, governance, citizenship, philanthropy, etc. It's all at the conference board website, conferenceboard.org, and you can look for our specific governance and sustainability center pages. We do also share, regular updates through newsletters and member briefings and LinkedIn. And I'm also active on LinkedIn. So for the listeners, feel free to connect and say hi.
Great. All right, Andrew. Well, I'm going to give you the mic and have you send our listeners a final message. So the floor is yours.
I appreciate that, Emma. I think if I was giving a sort of final takeaway to the audience, I perhaps say, the world is fragmented right now, right? And maybe even fractured when it comes to ESG and ESG policy. We see sort of regulations diverging, whether it's across or within countries. We see obviously a lot of, backlash that we spoke about on this call. But I do think the fundamentals of all of this work, right? Cost savings, risk management, innovation, transformation, they do remain material, right? They remain universal drivers of business success. And I think that's where to focus, right? To cut through the noise and really hone in on the actions and the investments that create measurable value, strength and resilience, and position, your company or your organization to adapt and compete regardless of shifting political or policy sort of trends and landscapes. That would be hopefully my optimistic take at the end of this discussion.
I love it. And that advice was informed by real data, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you so much for being on the show, Andrew. And we hope to continue the conversation soon.
Sure. It was a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me so much, Emma. And yeah, look forward to hopefully doing this again sometime.
Thanks for tuning in to ESG Decoded. We hope this episode has inspired you to take action in your own ESG journey, stimulating ideas for partnership and innovation.
New episodes drop bi-weekly on Tuesday morning. Subscribe now on your favorite streaming platform to stay in the loop.
Join the conversation on social media using @ESG Decoded or visit climbco.com for more resources.
Until next time, keep decoding, keep innovating, and keep making a positive impact.